The human had only meant to pass through the ruins, a forgotten stretch of stone and silence under an alien sky. He wasn't expecting to hear voices, small, fragile, and trembling with desperation. When he turned, he found them, a cluster of wide-eyed alien girls, their delicate frames shivering in the cold wind, their strange, luminous eyes fixed on him as if he were their last hope. They begged, voices breaking with fear, hands clutching at his worn jacket, pleading for protection from something he had not yet seen. He thought he understood what they wanted, but what happened next neither they nor he could have imagined. The human had not planned to stay long on this forsaken world, let alone discover something that would pull him deeper into its shadows. He had come because the maps marked this region as barren, the remains of a civilization long extinguished by time or conflict, with only broken stonework and scattered relics left to whisper what once had been. He had expected dust, silence, and perhaps the faint echo of history clinging to crumbling walls, but what he found was something else entirely. The air carried a strange tension, a heaviness that was not just the product of abandonment, but of lives recently displaced, of fear that lingered like smoke after a fire. He followed that feeling through corridors half buried in sand and chambers where alien glyphs traced faded stories into the walls, and he could not shake the sensation that eyes were on him, though none could be seen. It was as he passed beneath the collapsed arch of what might once have been a grand hall that he heard the sound, small at first, a whisper too soft to be wind. He paused, holding his breath, straining to catch it again, and then it came, high-pitched, fragile, like the voice of someone on the edge of tears. He advanced cautiously, his boots crunching against shards of broken tile, hand near his weapon but unwilling to draw it yet. The sound grew clearer, multiplied, until it became a chorus of tiny voices, desperate, pleading, laced with a fear so raw that it pierced through him more effectively than any blade could. When he turned the corner, he froze. Huddled against the remnants of a fallen pillar was a group of children. No, not human children, but alien in every way yet undeniably vulnerable. They were small, their limbs slender and delicate, their skin marked with faint bioluminescent patterns that flickered dimly like fading stars. Their eyes were far too large for their faces, shining with a strange inner light that reflected his presence back at him in trembling uncertainty. They clung to one another, shivering, their small hands gripping whatever scraps of fabric or debris they could find as if it might shield them from the world that hunted them. When they saw him, their voices faltered for a moment, replaced by a stunned silence, and then rose again in urgent cries. They pressed forward as much as their tiny bodies dared, their strange tongues stumbling into fragmented words of a language not their own, but words he understood nonetheless. "Help, please, help us." Their accents were broken, their pronunciation halting, but the meaning needed no translation. They were terrified, and somehow, they had decided that he was the answer to their desperation. The human blinked, taken aback, his mind racing. He had expected ruins, danger perhaps, but not this. He had seen children before, both human and alien, but never like this, never so utterly fragile, never so vulnerable, and yet so determined to survive. He crouched down slowly, lowering himself so as not to tower over them, trying to make his voice calm, steady, something they could cling to in their fear. They flinched at the movement but did not retreat, their desperation outweighing their caution. Their hands reached for him, tiny fingers clutching at the fabric of his jacket as if it were the only lifeline left in the universe. He could feel the tremor of their touch, the way their whole bodies shook with exhaustion and dread, and he realized that whatever had driven them to this state was still near, still a threat that lingered in the shadows. His eyes swept the ruins, searching for signs, for tracks, for anything that might reveal what hunted them. He found the faint marks in the dust, large and heavy, claws etched into stone, the kind of prints left by something built for killing. The girls had been running, hiding, trying to evade whatever beast or foe stalked them, and somehow they had survived long enough to stumble into him. His first instinct was to question why they would turn to him, a stranger, a species perhaps unknown to them, but then he realized that desperation knew no boundaries. To them he was not a man or an alien, he was someone who could fight, someone larger, stronger, someone who might stand between them and the nightmare pressing in from the dark. He wanted to speak, to promise them safety, but his throat caught on the weight of such words. He had seen enough battles, enough wars to know that promises of safety were fragile things, easily broken, often shattered by the very enemies they were meant to defy. And yet when he looked into their eyes, wide and glistening, filled with the kind of hope born only from utter despair, he felt something shift within him. He could not walk away. He could not pretend he had not heard their pleas. His own people had once faced annihilation, had once cried out for salvation, and had found it only through those willing to stand when all others fled. These children, alien though they were, now looked to him in the same way, and he felt the weight of that history press onto his shoulders. He reached out, not quickly, but with deliberate care, letting one of them press her trembling hand into his. Her skin was cool, the faint glow of her markings warming slightly at his touch, as though his presence reassured her. The others edged closer, their small forms pressing around him, drawing strength simply from his nearness. He had never thought of himself as a savior, but in that moment he understood that to them, he was exactly that. The ruins seemed less empty now, less silent, filled instead with the fragile rhythm of their breaths and the pounding of his heart as he tried to think of what to do next. The sun was sinking beyond the jagged horizon, shadows deepening into something oppressive, and he knew that whatever hunted them would soon grow bolder under cover of darkness. He could not remain still, not with the weight of those luminous eyes fixed on him, not with their hands clinging as though letting go would mean death. He tightened his grip on the strap of his pack, shifted his stance and prepared himself for the unknown, aware that this moment, the simple act of answering a plea, was about to draw him into something far greater than he had imagined when he first set foot among these ruins. Their voices, small and quivering, filled the air with a desperation that could not be ignored, and the humans soon understood what it was they wanted from him. They were not merely lost, not simply frightened children seeking comfort, they were pleading for protection from something far more terrible than abandonment. Their eyes darted constantly toward the shadows, their trembling hands clutching at his clothing as though he were the only solid anchor in a storm of terror. The words they spoke were fragmented, their grasp of his language imperfect, yet the meaning came through with the weight of a stone dropped in still water. "They come," one of them whispered, the glow of her markings flickering erratically. "Hunters, bad ones, kill." The others echoed her words in broken harmony, their small bodies pressing closer, their faces pale beneath the strange sheen of their skin. He felt their fear in the way their voices cracked, in the way they huddled as one tight cluster, unwilling to break apart even for a breath, as if only the closeness of their bodies gave them any chance to survive. He listened intently, his own instincts sharpening. He had been a soldier once, or something close enough that the discipline of survival never truly left him, and the tone of their pleas awoke something deep inside, something that stirred like an old weapon retrieved from storage. Children did not invent terror of that depth. They did not conjure trembling sobs and wide darting eyes without cause. Whatever haunted them was real, close, and it was something they believed only he could resist. He lowered himself further, his voice calm and steady, asking them to explain more, to tell him what followed. Their words came haltingly, a mixture of desperate gestures and broken phrases, but from the fragments he pieced together a grim picture. They had fled from creatures not human, not of their own kind, predators that stalked through the ruins with patience and cruelty. The hunters did not kill quickly. They toyed, they chased, they tore apart small groups, leaving survivors to run in terror, ensuring their fear spread before the next pursuit. As the alien girls spoke, he could see the trauma etched in their every motion. Their eyes lingered too long on shadowed corners, their ears twitched at the smallest sound of crumbling stone, and their glow dimmed whenever they recalled what had happened to others who had not escaped. They were survivors of something brutal, something relentless, and though they were far too young to bear such burdens, necessity had forced them into it. And now they were looking at him, a stranger, with the hope that he could stand where they could not, that his larger frame, his strange tools and the strength they imagined in him might be enough to defy the hunters who had already stolen so much from them. The human felt the weight of their faith pressing on him like the barrel of a gun. It would have been easier to turn away, to tell them he was not their savior, to escape while he could before whatever stalked them found its way to his position. But he could not. Their voices dug into him, not just as pleas but as demands from the universe itself, reminders of every time his own kind had once cried out for help in battles long past. He had seen civilians sheltering in ruined cities, clutching their children as the sky rained fire, begging soldiers to protect them. He had been among those who heard those cries, and he had carried the memory of the times when help had come too late. Now, here, on a world that was not his own, those echoes rose again through the mouths of these alien girls, and he knew he could not allow himself to fail them. He asked them where they had come from, how long they had been hiding, and their responses were fragmented but haunting. They had been many once, not just this small cluster. Families had lived together in the outskirts, trying to survive after their world had been broken by some unknown war, but the hunters had descended on them, tearing through shelters, scattering survivors. These few had fled, running through the ruins for days, guided by instinct and desperation, their numbers dwindling with every encounter. Now only they remained, weary and hollow-eyed, their hope hanging by a thread. That thread was now tied around him, and he felt its pull deep into his chest. The ruins themselves bore testimony to their words. He had noticed claw marks earlier, but now he looked closer and saw more. Gouges in stone, where something immense had dragged its way through, streaks of dried fluids that might have been blood, bones scattered in places half buried by sand. The size of the remains was not human, but it was small enough to suggest young ones like those who clung to him. He did not let his face betray what he saw, but his grip on his pack tightened, his mind already calculating what resources he had and how he might hold against such predators.
He did not know the exact nature of what hunted them, but he knew predators, knew their habits, their reliance on fear and intimidation, and he knew that fear could be resisted if someone had the strength to stand. The children were not just pleading anymore, they were begging with every fiber of their being. Their voices rose in unison, broken phrases repeated again and again. Please stay, protect us, don't leave. He had never been the type to enjoy being the center of anyone's faith, but he could not deny them. He saw the way their trembling slowed when he spoke firmly, the way their shoulders eased slightly when he placed himself between them and the darkness beyond the shattered archways. They had already decided he was their shield, whether he agreed or not, and he realized he had no choice but to embrace that role. The air grew colder as the alien sun dipped lower, the ruins shifting from shades of gray to the deeper hues of twilight. The children huddled closer, their faint glows pulsing in rhythm with their fear, and he knew the hunters would come soon. Darkness was their ally, and nightfall would embolden them. The girls knew it too, for they whispered frantically among themselves, their words carrying the rhythm of prayer or ritual, clinging to scraps of comfort that might keep their courage intact. He understood then that their plea was more than a request, it was the last stand of their hope, cast entirely upon him. If he faltered, they would have nothing left, no shield, no defense, no reason to believe survival was possible. He rose to his feet, scanning the surroundings, weighing the ground, the possible choke points, the debris that could be turned to use. The girls looked up at him with wide, unblinking eyes, their small hands still holding his jacket, but loosening slightly as though they sensed that he was preparing himself. He did not tell them it would be all right, for he knew words meant little when monsters prowled in the dark. Instead, he let his movements speak, the calm way he adjusted his weapon, the steady way he checked the walls and angles, the deliberate care with which he placed himself as a barrier between them and the growing shadows. They saw it, and though their fear did not vanish, it shifted, tempered by the faintest flicker of belief that perhaps this strange being before them could do what none of their kind had managed. The children pressed close behind him, whispering still, their glowing eyes fixed on his back as though it were the last wall between them and oblivion. He stood tall in the ruins, listening to the faint sounds that drifted from beyond, the scraping of claws, the low guttural growl of something circling, waiting, testing. He felt the tension coil in his chest, his senses sharpening, and he understood that the moment was coming soon, when their pleas for protection would no longer be words but a test of action, when their desperate trust in him would be answered not by promises but by defiance against the darkness that hunted them. The human did not need the children's trembling voices to know that the danger closing in around them was more than they fully understood. Their descriptions had been broken, scattered by fear, their gestures frantic and uncertain, but he could tell from the signs left in the ruins that what pursued them was not merely a beast acting on instinct. The claw marks gouged into the stone were not random scratches of a hungry predator, they were deliberate, patterns of intimidation, marks of territory made by creatures intelligent enough to wield fear as a weapon. The way bones were scattered and stripped clean, the methodical trails of destruction through chambers that might otherwise have remained untouched, spoke of something that killed not only for food but for dominance. He had seen such signs before in the aftermath of wars, when certain enemy forces left behind symbols carved into walls or corpses arranged to send messages. He recognized cruelty, and cruelty was not something the children could yet comprehend. They clung to the simple idea that the hunters wanted to harm them, but they did not understand the depth of what that meant. He could see it in the way they whispered among themselves, speaking of monsters in the dark, as though they were simply large animals, dangerous but defeatable with hiding and luck. They did not know what he suspected, that their pursuers were organized, deliberate, and relentless. He studied the terrain as he listened to their small voices, the corridors narrowing and widening in strange rhythms, the fallen pillars creating choke points, the shadows lengthening in uneven stretches where light dared not reach. Every instinct in him warned that the hunters had studied this place too, that they were driving the children here intentionally, narrowing their choices until panic and exhaustion would finish what claws and teeth began. The human crouched near one of the claw marks and ran his fingers across the grooves, deep, clean, with pressure behind them that required strength beyond most natural predators. He calculated weight, speed, angles, and his mind assembled an image of creatures built for pursuit and brutality. The girls pressed close to him, whispering his name, not his real one, but a crude attempt at it from the fragments they had heard him say earlier. Their voices carried both trust and fear, as though repeating his name was a charm that might ward away the nightmare. He let them continue, their voices grounding him even as he considered the grim truth. The predators had not simply found the children, they had hunted them, driven them, perhaps even chosen them specifically. The ruins bore evidence of struggle, of families scattered, and yet only these few remained. He doubted it was coincidence. The hunters were leaving survivors on purpose, chasing them into exhaustion, savoring the terror. It was a tactic he had seen in the worst of wars, where cruelty was used not only to destroy bodies but to break spirits. These alien girls, still young, still fragile, were being toyed with by an enemy that understood psychological torment far better than they did. He could not tell them this truth. It would shatter what little composure they still clung to. But he knew it, and the knowledge hardened him. The ruins themselves seemed complicit, their jagged walls echoing with faint sounds that could have been wind, but carried the rhythm of footsteps too deliberate, too calculated. He scanned constantly, watching for movement, for the faint glint of eyes or the scrape of talons. The children clutched at his legs whenever he turned too quickly, their tiny voices rising in fearful questions, asking if the hunters were near, if he could see them. He gave no false comfort, but he spoke with calm authority, reminding them to stay close, to keep silent when he signaled, to trust him even when their instincts screamed to run. They nodded with wide eyes, their trust absolute, even though they had no way of knowing whether he truly had the strength to protect them. He thought back to his own past, to times when civilians had begged soldiers for help during campaigns in shattered cities, when frightened families had pressed themselves into the arms of men armed with little more than determination and outdated rifles. He had seen both outcomes, times when those soldiers had managed to hold the line, and times when they had been overrun, leaving behind only silence and broken promises. Now, standing in these alien ruins, he felt the echo of those moments rising in him again, urging him to be more than he had been before, to refuse the failure that had haunted him. The children's lack of full understanding became more apparent the longer he listened. They spoke of the hunters in terms of shapes and shadows, describing glowing eyes, claws, and snarling sounds, but they did not realize the significance of the patterns left behind. They did not grasp that the way the bodies had been left in the open, the way the paths had been herded toward choke points, were signs of a calculated strategy. He realized they believed escape might be as simple as running far enough or finding the right hiding place, and that ignorance might destroy them if he did not act decisively. Their innocence was heartbreaking, but it was also dangerous. He needed them to listen to him not as a frightened stranger, but as someone who could see truths they could not. So he began to guide them carefully, speaking in simple words, gestures, and motions they could understand. He showed them how to stay quiet, how to move slowly when he signaled, how to keep their eyes on him instead of the shadows that tempted them into panic. They listened, not fully understanding why, but trusting his tone, the authority in his movements. He could feel their hope clinging to him like vines, fragile yet persistent, and he allowed it to settle into him even as he planned for the inevitable confrontation. The night deepened, and with it the sense of menace grew. He heard it now, the scrape of claws against stone, not loud but deliberate, a sound meant to be noticed. The hunters were testing them, reminding them of their presence, savoring the fear it provoked. The children whimpered, their voices breaking into soft sobs, but he steadied them with a firm hand, reminding them to stay quiet. He could feel their bodies shivering against his legs, their bioluminescent markings flickering erratically like failing lanterns. They were terrified, but they were not yet broken, and he swore to himself he would not allow them to reach that point. The hunters were far more dangerous than the children could possibly comprehend, and that danger was drawing nearer with every passing heartbeat. The human braced himself, his senses sharpening, his mind running through every possibility of terrain, of cover, of makeshift defenses. The girls looked up at him with desperate eyes, still half believing the nightmare could be warded off by his mere presence. He did not let his own fear show, though it coiled within him like a serpent, for he knew that their survival depended on his ability to project unshakable resolve. They did not yet understand the true scope of the threat, but he did, and that knowledge settled into him like steel, hardening his will to face whatever came from the shadows.
The ruins offered little in the way of comfort, but to the human they were more than just broken walls and fractured pillars. They were an arsenal waiting to be awakened. Years of conflict had taught him to see more than rubble and shattered places. Every stone, every shard of metal, every fallen beam was a tool, a weapon, a barrier that could be repurposed with the right mindset. The alien girls clung to him still, their eyes wide and shimmering with frightened light, but he had already begun to pull free from the paralysis of their fear. His mind moved into calculation, assessing choke points where the predators could be funneled, ledges that might serve as vantage points, debris that could be reshaped into traps. He moved with quiet precision, not wasting a gesture, his hands brushing over fragments of the alien civilization as if he were reading a map etched into their very bones. The children followed him hesitantly, whispering questions he did not answer. To them, the ruins were simply a labyrinth of shadows where danger lurked. They could not yet understand what he was doing as he dragged broken timbers into tighter spaces, stacked loose stones into crude walls, and tested the weight of shattered beams that might fall with the right pressure. He gathered lengths of wire from the remnants of what might once have been machinery, stretching them across low passages where small claws might snag and stumble. He pried loose, jagged fragments of stone and arranged them where bare feet or unguarded steps might be cut and slowed. Where the ground sloped unevenly, he laid shards that would slide beneath weight, turning footing treacherous. The ruins became less a tomb and more a fortress under his hands, though to anyone untrained it still looked like little more than scattered rubble. He worked quickly, silently, the rhythm of survival driving him forward. The hunters would come with the night, he was certain, and there was no time to explain. The girl's small hands tried to help, but he guided them instead to stay close, to hold light scraps, to watch and learn without stumbling into the dangers he was creating. Their eyes followed his every motion, confusion slowly giving way to awe as they realized he was not merely wandering aimlessly, but shaping their surroundings with purpose. They whispered among themselves, the cadence of their alien tongue filled with wonder as they clutched each other tighter. In the broken courtyard that lay open to the darkening sky, he found the remnants of collapsed statues, massive slabs of stone half buried in the sand. With grunts of effort he shifted them, angling them into barricades that would funnel movement into narrow passages. He tested each opening, ensuring that anything charging through would have to expose itself. He left gaps where he wanted the hunters to come, guiding them into paths of his choosing. He had learned long ago that to fight a stronger predator you did not resist it head-on. You shaped the battlefield so that its strength turned into weakness. The children began to sense what he was doing. They clung a little less tightly, their eyes following the lines of stone and debris he arranged, whispering soft words that carried both fear and hope. One of them touched his sleeve, her voice fragile as she asked if these walls could truly keep the monsters out. He met her gaze but did not give her false promises. Instead, he placed her small hand against the cold stone and let her feel the solidity of what he had built. She nodded slowly, perhaps not understanding the full meaning but sensing enough to draw courage. The others pressed forward, placing their hands too, as though the wall itself might absorb their fear. The sky dimmed further, the alien sun slipping below the jagged horizon, shadows thickening into an oppressive shroud. The human's work grew more urgent. He scavenged lengths of broken wood, sharpening them into crude spikes with the edge of his knife. He embedded them into cracks and set them at angles where momentum would do the rest. He dug shallow pits where the ground was soft, covering them with debris so that a misstep would turn into a fall. He scavenged remnants of metal, testing the sharpness of edges, lashing them into makeshift blades that could be tied to poles or hurled as last resort weapons. His every action spoke of experience, of a lifetime spent turning the least into enough. And the children watched in rapt silence, their earlier sobs quieting as they became witnesses to a different kind of strength. Their fear did not vanish, but it began to change shape. Where before it had been a choking helplessness, now it was mixed with something new, something that shone in their eyes even as their small bodies trembled. They had begged him for protection, imagining perhaps that he would simply stand in front of them like a shield. But now they saw something far more complex. He was not waiting passively for the hunters to arrive. He was shaping the fight before it began, bending the ruins to his will, refusing to let the predators dictate the terms. To the alien girls, this was something beyond imagination. Their people had run, had scattered, had been torn apart by the merciless chase, but this human was standing his ground and turning decay into defiance. As he worked, he thought of the times in his past, when he and his comrades had done the same in their own wars, fortifying burned-out buildings with sandbags, stringing wire through alleys, rigging traps with whatever explosives could be scavenged. He thought of the faces of civilians who had hidden behind those makeshift walls, their trust heavy on his shoulders. This moment was no different, except that these were children of another species, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark, their bodies trembling with fear, yet their desperation felt familiar, as if he had known them all his life, as if their pleas were echoes of the same cries he had answered before. When the final adjustments were made, he guided the children to a sheltered alcove near the heart of his defenses, a place where they could cluster together in relative safety. He crouched before them, showing them how to stay low, how to remain silent, how to press against the stone when he signaled. They listened with rapt attention, their alien features mirroring the same solemn expressions he had once seen on human children who had been taught to hide during bombardments. The similarity struck him deeply, but he did not let his thoughts linger. There was no time for reflection. The night had fully descended now, the ruins cloaked in shadow, the air alive with the weight of something approaching. The human could hear it, the faint scrape of claws, the whisper of movement just beyond sight. The children stiffened, their faint glows flickering, their breaths catching in terrified gasps. He steadied them with a firm glance, his posture radiating a calm they could borrow. Around him, the traps waited in silence, the barricades stood firm, the sharpened spikes glistened faintly in the weak light. The ruins were no longer just ruins. Under his hands they had become weapons, defenses, a fortress standing against the darkness. He adjusted his grip on his blade, his body steady, his eyes fixed on the passage where he knew the first of the hunters would come. The children huddled together, watching him, their small hands clutching at each other, their eyes wide with trust. They had begged him for help, and he had answered not only with strength, but with ingenuity, turning the broken remnants of a fallen world into the teeth and claws of defiance. The hunters would come soon,
But when they did, they would find not prey cowering in fear, but a battlefield shaped by human hands. The first sounds of the hunters came as whispers carried on the night air, low growls that echoed through the ruined arches, reverberating along the stone corridors with a rhythm designed to unsettle. The alien girls stiffened immediately, their glowing patterns flaring and dimming erratically as panic coursed through them. They pressed against each other in their sheltered alcove, their wide eyes never leaving the human figure standing at the center of the traps and barricades he had built. He stood tall and motionless, listening, reading the cadence of the sounds, the way they rose and fell. These creatures were not simply prowling, they were communicating, calling to one another, coordinating their advance. The children did not hear it for what it was, but he did, and it only confirmed what he had already suspected. This was no mindless hunt, but a deliberate strategy. He inhaled slowly, steadying his nerves, recalling every lesson burned into him from years of conflict. Panic was the enemy. Fear was a tool to be turned back on those who wielded it. He pressed his hand to the cold stone, grounding himself, then shifted slightly to adjust his stance. His knife gleamed faintly, its blade dulled from long use but still sharp enough to kill. Around him, the crude defenses waited in silence, each trap a promise of resistance. The girls whispered his name again, their voices trembling, but he lifted one hand to still them, a gesture firm and unyielding. They fell silent, clinging to his presence, borrowing courage from the calm he radiated. The first shadow appeared at the edge of the barricade, a hulking form with limbs that moved too fluidly for its bulk. Its claws scraped against the stone deliberately, the sound meant to provoke fear. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin embers in the dark, fixed on the human with a predator's hunger. It stepped forward, testing the gap between two slabs of stone, and that was when his trap triggered. A loose pile of rubble, carefully balanced earlier, tumbled down in a sudden cascade, striking the creature's shoulders and forcing it to stumble. The impact was not enough to kill, but it was enough to make it falter, enough to draw a sharp hiss of pain from its throat. The children gasped, their small voices muffled by their own hands, and the human did not look back at them. His eyes remained locked on the predator, cold and calculating. The hunter recovered quickly, its claws gouging deep into the stone as it righted itself, but the human was already moving. He darted forward, his steps precise, and struck with his blade, driving it deep into the creature's side before retreating just as quickly. Blood spilled dark and hot across the ground, and the predator let out a guttural roar that echoed through the ruins. Other roars answered it in the distance, a chorus of rage and hunger. The children whimpered, their glowing eyes wide, but when they saw the human standing tall, his knife dripping with alien blood, something shifted in them. They had never seen such defiance, never witnessed one being faced the monsters head-on and not falter. The hunters closed in, their shadows slipping through the broken walls, their growls a steady drumbeat. The human did not yield ground. He shifted his weight, leading them along the narrow paths he had prepared, forcing them into choke points where their numbers counted for less. One lunged, massive claws flashing, but its foot struck a hidden pit, sending it crashing down with a howl of fury. Another slashed at him from the side, only to catch its limb on the wire he had stretched across the passage, stumbling long enough for his blade to meet its throat. The children pressed closer together, their fear still raw, but now it was threaded with awe. They had seen their families torn apart by these same monsters, seen them scatter entire groups with little effort, yet here was one human, alone, standing against them with nothing but scraps and resolve. Every strike he made was measured, every movement efficient. He fought not like a beast, thrashing wildly, but with the discipline of someone who had faced death before and learned its rhythms. He used the ruins as extensions of his body, leading the predators into places where their own strength betrayed them. A heavy slab toppled from above onto the back of one creature, driven loose by a single well-placed push. A sharpened beam caught another through the chest as it lunged recklessly into the path he had prepared. The air filled with snarls, the sound of claws scraping stone, the hiss of pain and rage as his trap struck true. The girls could hardly comprehend what they were seeing. Their people had always fled before the hunters, their only hope survival through escape, yet this human met them head-on, turned the very ruins into allies, and struck with a ferocity that seemed impossible from one alone. They whispered among themselves, their voices trembling but carrying a thread of wonder. Some clutched at the edges of their alcove as though torn between hiding and watching, their glowing eyes locked on him as he moved with precision and willpower that defied their understanding. The hunters were not mindless, and soon they adjusted, circling wider, testing his defenses with more caution. But even as they learned, he adapted. When one tried to climb along a wall to bypass a barricade, he hurled a shard of sharpened stone into its face, knocking it back with a howl. When another tested the ground carefully, avoiding the obvious traps, he met it with sheer force, driving his blade into its chest in a surge of brutal strength. His arms ached, his breath came harsh, but he did not stop. Every roar, every snarl only hardened him further, reminded him of every battle he had survived before. He could not fall here, not with those children watching, not with their fragile hopes bound entirely to him. Blood stained the ground, thick and alien, mixing with the dust of the ruins. The predators faltered, their numbers thinning, their confidence shaken by resistance they had not expected. They had chased these children believing them easy prey, yet here was a lone human who turned their hunt into a battlefield, who refused to yield. The air was thick with the stench of blood and fear, but for the first time, it was not only the children who trembled. The hunters themselves hesitated, their glowing eyes darting between the human and the traps that still waited. The alien girls clung together, their trembling less now from terror and more from the overwhelming disbelief of what they were witnessing. Their whispers rose again, but no longer only in fear. They spoke words of hope, fragile and halting, as if the sight before them was reshaping what they believed possible. They had begged him for help, expecting perhaps comfort or a shield to hide behind, but what they saw instead was something far greater. They watched him fight with courage and ferocity that defied everything they had known about survival, and for the first time since their flight began, they felt the spark of belief that the hunters could be defied, that strength could stand against cruelty. The human's muscles burned, his lungs strained, but his resolve only grew sharper. He fought not only for survival, but for the small voices behind him, for the glowing eyes that had pleaded with him in desperation, for the fragile trust placed in his hands. Every swing of his blade, every trap sprung, every roar silenced, was not just an act of defiance against the hunters, but a promise to the children that they were not alone, that their pleas had been answered not with pity, but with unyielding strength. The ruins rang with the clash of predator and human, with the cries of rage and the silence of sudden death, and in that storm of violence, the alien girls bore witness to something they would carry for the rest of their lives. They had asked for protection, but what they had been given was the sight of a human standing against the darkness itself, fearless, unbreakable, and unwilling to let them fall. When the echoes of snarls and the clash of stone against claw began to fade, the ruins fell into a silence that felt almost unnatural. The air still carried the acrid tang of blood, thick and cloying, but beneath it there was something else, a hollow quiet that only followed when predators had either been slain or driven off. The alien girls huddled together, their glowing patterns faint but steady now, eyes fixed on the human as though waiting for him to falter, to collapse, to reveal himself mortal after the fury they had just witnessed. But he did not fall. He stood amidst the carnage, chest heaving, weapon slick with blood, body marked with shallow cuts and bruises, yet unbroken. His eyes swept the shadows with the same wary vigilance as before, unwilling to assume safety even as the silence stretched longer. The children watched in awe, their breaths shallow, their small bodies trembling less from terror and more from something they had never felt before. They whispered to one another in their lilting language, their voices hushed, reverent, uncertain of how to name what they had seen. To them he was not just a protector, he was something larger, a figure who had turned fear itself into a weapon, who had faced the monsters that had shattered their people, and stood victorious. Their kind had never fought the hunters in such a way. They had only run, scattered, survived by chance. Yet here was one being who had refused to flee, who had shaped the broken ruins into defenses, and fought with a ferocity that none of them had believed possible. The human wiped his blade clean against a strip of cloth, each motion deliberate, his breathing slowly steadying as he forced himself back into control. His body ached with exhaustion, but he kept it hidden, knowing the children's eyes were still upon him, seeking reassurance in his every move. He turned toward them, and they shrank back instinctively, not in fear of him but in awe, uncertain how to reconcile the figure who had comforted them with the warrior who had just painted the ruins with blood. He knelt then, lowering himself to their level, his presence no longer towering but steady and grounded. He reached out a hand, and after a hesitant pause, one of the girls placed her small, trembling fingers in his palm. The glow in her markings pulsed faintly, steadier now, as though some of his resolve had seeped into her. The others followed, inching closer, until they surrounded him in a small cluster, their luminous eyes reflecting both exhaustion and something new, hope. They pressed close, their whispers shifting from fear to soft words of gratitude, though he did not understand every syllable. Gratitude needed no translation. He felt it in the way their small hands clung to his sleeves, in the way their trembling lessened as they leaned into him, in the way their eyes no longer darted to every shadow. For the first time since he had found them, their fear was not absolute. It was tempered by belief, a fragile flame flickering into life. He knew it would not last forever, that new dangers would come, that the hunters might return, or worse threats might arise, but for now this moment belonged to them. He scanned the ruins again, his mind still in the rhythm of survival, already thinking of water, of food, of the paths that might lead them to safer ground. Yet even as he planned, he felt the weight of what had just transpired settle upon him. This was more than survival. It was a story being written in their memories, a story that would spread through whispered voices long after the blood had dried. He could see it in their eyes, in the way they looked at him, not just as the human who had saved them, but as something larger, something they would carry with them as proof that the darkness could be fought. The children began to speak in their own tongue, faster now, their voices overlapping in excitement, their hands gesturing wildly as they tried to recount what they had just seen. He could not follow their words, but he recognized the tone, the energy of it. They were telling each other the story already, weaving it together before his eyes, shaping him into the figure they had witnessed through their own lenses of awe and disbelief. He became, in their words, not just a protector but a force, a defier of hunters, a breaker of fear. Their voices rose, fragile yet insistent, and he listened, silent, humbled in a way he had not expected. He did not see himself as they did. To him it had been survival, nothing more than instincts honed by years of hardship, a refusal to abandon those who begged for help. He had fought because he could not turn away, because leaving them to die would have been a betrayal of everything he once stood for. But to them, it was not merely survival, it was legend. They had seen death circle them, had felt despair gnaw at their souls, and they had seen one man stand in defiance of it all. The gap between how he perceived his actions and how they perceived them would never close, and perhaps that was for the best. Legends were born not from truth alone, but from the way truth was seen through the eyes of those who needed it most. The ruins, once suffocating with dread, now felt different. The silence no longer seemed oppressive, but filled with possibility, as though the echoes of the battle had carved something new into the stone. The children shifted closer to him, not just for safety but for comfort, their fragile bodies pressing against him as though he were warmth in the cold. He let them, his hand resting on the nearest shoulder, steady and reassuring. He did not speak, for words were too fragile to hold the weight of what had passed. Instead, he let the quiet linger, knowing that in this moment, their belief was more important than any promise he could make. The night pressed on, and the stars above the ruins shone cold and distant, indifferent to the blood spilled below. Yet beneath that indifferent sky, something had changed. The alien girls no longer looked like prey cowering in the shadows. They were still small, still fragile, but their eyes held a new light, faint but undeniable. They had witnessed what it meant to stand, to fight, to refuse despair. That memory would not fade, no matter how many more nights of fear awaited them. They would remember the human who had answered their cries, who had turned the ruins into a fortress, who had fought the hunters with a courage that seemed beyond the reach of one alone. The human rose again, his silhouette framed against the broken walls, a lone figure marked by blood and battle yet unbroken. The children's eyes followed him, and their whispers quieted into silence, as though simply watching him was enough to remind them they were not abandoned. He adjusted his pack, his knife still in his hand, his gaze sweeping the shadows with the same vigilance as before. The battle had ended, but the war for survival never truly did. Still, in this brief moment, amidst the ruins of a world forgotten, he had given them something greater than survival. He had given them a story they would carry forever, a story of defiance, of strength, of humanity standing unyielding against the dark. The dawn broke over the ruins, soft light spilling across shattered stone, and the stains of battle, painting the scene in fragile hues of gold. The alien girls stirred from restless sleep, their small forms curled close around the human, as though anchoring themselves to the presence that had shielded them through the night. Their eyes opened wide to the sky, filled with wonder rather than fear, and when they looked to him, it was not desperation but reverence that shone in their gaze. They whispered softly, voices trembling with awe, already carrying the weight of a legend being born.